provided, whatever that means, because obviously it will depend on users and the context and their needs. And then the provision, so how that service is provided and delivered to the users. Next slide, Masi, please. So this idea of the users, and this is again another point of kind of contention and discussion within this field. This idea of users as a very fluid and relative concept. So we can we tend to right or wrongly tend to say, treat climate services as a kind of dichotomic system, so between the producers and the users, and the reality is much more complex than that. So whilst we tend to perceive, for example, National Met Services, like the UK Met Office, as a producer of climate service, climate information, they can also be users. And the same for, the end users can also be producing information to other users. So when we talk about users, it needs to be very well defined, because it can mean very different things. And depending on the context, the users can easily become producers, or what I call the in-betweeners. So the people that are positioned between the spectrum of producers and users and intermediary organizations. Next slide. Oh, no, there is one before. Oh, so the climate information, and I'm just touching upon the three key aspects that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. So the aspect around that I want you to kind of grasp around the climate information and knowledge is the importance. There's two key points here. One is that there's a range of different types of climate information. So it goes from historical climate down to the long-term climate change projections. And in between, there's all these different ranges of timescales that cover different prediction lead times, and it provides different kinds of variables and has different types of probability attached to it. So it is important to understand that there's a whole array of different climate information that can be used when we're talking about climate services. So it can go from, like I said, historical climate data, but there's also the subseasonal timescales, the seasonal, so up to 6 months, a year ahead, and then the interannual predictions, which are still pretty much in the research realm. They're still not, available in the kind of the operational arena, and then the long-term climate change projections. So trends over the next 30, 60, 90 years. So it is important to understand that, because that will provide different kinds of information to different types of users. So you need to be aware of that. And then within that sits weather timescales, which are much more deterministic in comparison to climate information. And they are what is more commonly used within the users landscape. And there tends to be as well, depending on the users, there might be some confusion in terms of what we mean by weather and what we mean by climate. So it is important to also understand that different groups, different organizations might have different understandings of these kind of timescales. And then finally, there's in terms of the data itself, it can vary from raw model data being spit out by supercomputers in terms of what's coming up, down to the very refined tailored products where when there's some level of post-processing and translation in terms of what the users need. And then there's also from simple essential climate variables like temperature, precipitation, down to very kind of complex indexes that can be provided to the users. So there's all this very complex landscape of what can be considered as climate information when we're talking about climate services. Next slide, please. Finally, there's the provision, so the in-between, right, between the climate information and to the point that gets to the end user. These kind of climate service in general can be provided in different contexts. A lot of it at the moment, I don't know for sure, but there's a lot of research on climate services. So in this context, the climate services, like for example, in the context of medical, the climate services are being developed within a research context. Therefore, they are bounded by the time we have in the project, whilst there are climate services being developed and provided in a more operational setting. So where there are official services being provided and sustained by organizations like, for example, National Met Services or private consultancies. And that links to the next point, which is there's also this distinction between services that are developed and provided in a commercial context, so the end users pay for that service, versus freely services that might be available through, for example, a National Met Service website. So there's that distinction. And then again, this idea of being, this spectrum of how tailored the services are. So how tailored the services are to the end user's needs. And yeah, that's it, I think. Next slide. Are there any questions on this? By the way, as I said, feel free to ask and interrupt and suggest things. Otherwise, I'll just continue. I can't see any hands, please. If there is any hands, let me know. Okay, so I'll now go back to this idea of why we need climate services in the first place, why this need emerged recently. So this is a fairly recent field, as in being officially kind of conceptualized as climate services. So this idea of translating climate information into decision-making context is not new, but in the specific, as it's specifically framed at the moment and conceptualized as a field, climate service emerged in 2009. So it's not very old concept. And it emerged from a number of different reasons. One of them being this recognition in the area that there is no direct link. There wasn't a linearity between producing climate information and that being used on the ground. So there was this recognition that there was something that was missing in that link between producing a lot of data and that actually not being implemented on the ground. And with that came this idea that perhaps to make that information more useful, more usable to the users, we needed to involve them in the development of the science, in the development of the research being done in terms of how we develop climate information and climate science. So this idea of, and these are links with key ideas such as increasing credibility, legitimacy, and the saliency, which is done by work from North American colleagues, Cash et al., in the early 2000s, and this idea that in order to increase the usability of climate information, that we need to somehow integrate those that are going to be using that information in the process of developing the science. And with that came also this idea of the co-production, which I'll talk a bit more about in the next few slides, but this idea that if we are to bring non-scientific actors,
Sorry, Marta. Sorry to interrupt you. There is a hand raised by Tony.
Tony?
Tony, you are muted.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just had a question that I've been thinking of for a while. Is the research that's been done on the provision of climate services, the development of climate services, is that something that academia and maybe government agencies are trying to figure out just recently, but it's been done by the private sector for a longer time? Or is that something that we're sort of all figuring out together right now?
I see your point. So is this kind of, I think there's a couple of things here. One is that this idea, and that's what I was saying before, this idea of actually using climate information to inform specific pathways on how we do things. So kind of to, for example, better adapt to adaptation, climate change adaptation, or to help us manage disaster risk management situations, for example, is not new. What is new here is this recognition that specifically focusing on the development of climate information and climate science. So that's the kind of the recognition that to better increase the usability of climate science, we need to involve the users. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, so it's basically more proactively including the users rather than developing the climate science at mercy of, not at mercy, but at the will of the scientific community, and then hope for the best. We're trying to be more proactive in terms of bringing those that have a direct interest in using this information into the development of the science itself. So it's kind of
I guess.
Yeah. But I was going to ask you the other. Sorry. Go on.
Sorry. I guess what I'm trying to say is, or what I'm wondering is, are companies in the private sector, kind of like DECOP or SOGRAP, have they been developing climate services for themselves for longer, and sort of academia is just trying to sort of conceptualize them more recently? Or is that a concept that's sort of new for everyone at the table?
Yeah, I can let Antonio and Javier perhaps respond to that, but I can give you my perception of things. I think as a concept, this is fairly new. It doesn't mean that they have not been using weather and climate information before, perhaps to different extents, but it's the conceptualization that is fairly recent. Also within Europe, there's been a movement over the last 5 years. So the European Commission put out what they call the roadmap for a climate service market, where they try and promote the uptake and development of climate service by the private sector. So kind of putting, trying to promote the private sector in terms of consultancy working in this area to kind of take a lead in developing climate services and things like that. But in terms of organizations themselves that are trying to make use of weather and climate information, they might have been using already climate information to inform their decision-making processes, but my understanding is that they didn't call them climate services. But perhaps I'll let Antonio and Javier maybe have a say. Antonio, do you want to come in?
Yeah, well, we pretty much nailed it. That's exactly it. I mean, we have been doing it before, but we did not call it climate services. Yeah. Actually, the concept, I'm not really sure if we can say that the concept was within us before we joined a former project where Marta was as well, and some other people in MedGold, which was Euporius, which was our first contact with the organization of a climate service. What I can say is that before that, that is before we understood climate services as a concept, we had been developing what would be called the climate service with other providers. But in the end of the day, I believe that there has been a kind of a parallel development both in academia and in industry that came together when the concept was formulated and deployed.
Okay, thanks. Javier, do you want to add anything, or are you okay for me to continue?
Yes, in the same line to Antonio, for the code, it is the climate service a very, very new concept, and well, we are learning a lot of from this project from MedGold in order to be able to know where this kind of tool can be used in the olive value chain. For us, it is a challenge to change the mentality or to add this tool in our sector. I think this is a very new tool, and the olive sector need to learn to use it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Javier. I should also say
thanks.
that, sorry, Tony, but I hope it kind of answers your question. It's kind of, it is a bit of a gray area in some contexts, because some people have been using it before, but it only came, it was only officially, conceptualized at this 2009 conference in Switzerland, where the WMO came in and said, this is now a definition we're working on. So this is it. And that kind of deployed and kind of led to this explosion of initiatives and efforts towards specifically climate services. But it doesn't mean that private sector hasn't been using climate information. It's just now this intention of including the users and ensuring, or try, make efforts towards improving the usability of that science and information to specific contexts is much more at the forefront of the efforts. And I think with that also there's this recognition of this being, in terms of research, this being a branch of applied research rather than basic research. So this is really, the effort is on having this applied research efforts in terms of interdisciplinary science. So bringing together mixed teams where there are different expertise in terms of social sciences, climatology, even like economics, psychology, coming together to really try and improve the usability of climate science to specific users. Yeah.
There are some hand raised by Alessandro and Antonio.
Yes, no, just a very quick comment. In terms of European Commission, in terms of research funded by the European Commission, I remember that the first research project on explicitly on climate service were about the 2011, more or less. The first couple of projects on this is ECLIS and ClimRun. ClimRun led by Enea and ECLIS led by Metoffice, if I correctly remind, or something like this. And so it is just 10 years ago that the European Commission started funding something on climate service. This is at least my my experience on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide a couple of examples of what climate services did we use before we called it climate services. Of course, we use weather services, which is not exactly the same thing, for forecasts, and we took it. Actually, I took it a little bit further than most people, because when I worked as a winemaker, there is always that very dreadful moment in 1 to 2 weeks before you set the harvest, when you really have to decide where you are going to tell your farmers that they should start harvesting. And so instead of just relying on our National Weather Service that had their weather stations quite far away from our vineyard areas, I started learning and to interpret synoptic charts that were being broadcast by WeatherFax services around Europe, and I would look at that every day. But still, this is weather. So the very first climate service that we joined in, and that was fully funded by private capital, was a projection done for the Douro region back in 2010. It started in 2010 and it lasted until 2012. So in 2012 it was deployed and made available. So that was a projection into the future to 2020, 2050 and 2080 of temperature and rainfall patterns at a 1 kilometer spatial resolution that was done. And that was fully funded by an association of about 100 farmers and wine companies in the Douro that hired a very high profile climatologists from the United States who came here, stayed here, did the model, did the projection, and went back home. So just to give you a context of how it was being done before the concept of climate services came to us.
Okay, thanks, Antonio. Marcy, next slide. I just crack on, so feel free to interrupt and ask things, but I'm just conscious of time and the amount of slides I still have to go through. So, oh, hey, you don't need to go that fast, Marcy. Thanks. So just a couple of things here, just to make you perhaps aware or raise this as based on my experience and having worked on climate service projects for the last 10 years. The difference, the complexity of the landscape of users, whoever they are, and their needs. So there's different types of, not only there's different types of users, and obviously different types of organizations will require different types of information. They have different resources available, different ways of operating internally, different demands, different expectations, and all of that influences how we set up the climate services. There's also different, and this is linked with the level of resources they have, the different levels of expertise and technical knowledge within the organizations to actually act upon the climate information. And then there's also this idea of the fact that climate information is normally one out of a set of different concerns and tensions that they need to deal with, and depending on the type of information, the type of organization, it might not actually be that critical for them in terms of climate information. And again, this idea of the separation between weather and climate information also sometimes, depending on the context, depending on the organizations, there might not be that much of a separation between these two. So, for example, I did a project in China, and I was interviewing people there, organizations, mainly government organizations, in terms of their use of climate information, with it translated, of course, because I don't speak Chinese. But very quickly I very quickly realized that they didn't have a different word for weather and a different word for climate. So we had to overcome that very quickly, trying to really unpack what we meant by weather and climate. So this is also something that we that work in this area, it's very straightforward what we mean by weather and climate, but for others, that might not be the case. Next slide, please. And this is based on work by Maria Carmen Lemos et al. This is a really good paper if you want to know a bit more about barriers and enablers to the use of climate information, particularly seasonal forecasts in organizations. And this idea that there are key areas that we need to basically ensure that we are working towards when we work with specific users to develop specific climate services. So this idea that it needs to be information that is provided in the time they need it, needs to be relevant to their specific decision-making, needs to be easily accessible, accurate, and accuracy can also mean different things for different people. So what we mean by accuracy might not be exactly what they need. So that also needs to be a point for discussion. And then obviously needs to be credible, right? The origins where the information comes from is very important. And that was also something we pick up on the project, one of the first projects as well on climate services, the Oporius project. We very quickly realized that the trust between the providers and users was very, very important for the uptake of seasonal forecasts in Europe, for example. So there's a number of aspects that needs to be considered when we engage with users in the development of climate services. And then this idea that their needs are not static. They tend to evolve. They have different needs. Organizations are very complex entities, so different people within the organization will have different needs. And all of that needs to be captured and understood when we're developing specific climate services for specific organizations. Next slide, please. Any questions on this? This is just an example, which it's just to highlight some of the things I was just saying. So this is, again, I think this is It is. This is from the interviews we've done for the Oporius project. So we basically interviewed around 80 organizations across Europe, across different sectors. And this picture just provides an idea of the range of activities and the areas where different sectors see the potential use of from weather information down to long-term climate change projections. So this idea that, for example, the health sector reacting very quickly to individual outbreaks, so they need to have kind of day-to-day, almost like nowcast forecasts, right? Kind of they need to check the situation as it comes in, and then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the transport sector, where they told us that, like, it's about long-term investments. It's about how we plan our roads network, and therefore we need long-term climate change projections, and then everything in between. So this is just to give you, a flavor of kind of the range of different needs and the different kind of areas within they operate and where the information might fit. Next slide. Oh, questions. Sorry, I know I'm kind of bombarding you with ideas, but it's just a quick flavor. The slides will be available online. I'll be available throughout, so we can have a bit more of a chat if you want to explore some of these ideas. I also provide some of the papers I mentioned here at the end, so you can also have a look at that if useful and if you want to learn a bit more about that. But are there any kind of burning questions right now, or can we continue? Any hands raised? No?
Marta, please, could you share your version of the presentation, since we have a problem with the presenting laptop. I have to restart my laptop for the presentation.
What did I tell you? Too many laptops. Let me see. So can you stop? Well, I can, let me see. Take over.
You can simply take over. Okay, yes.
Yeah. Can you see?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So fingers crossed that my internet doesn't, go bust, because that might happen as well.
We have also other plan. We have also B plan, C plan. We have other backup
C,
possible.
plan D. And this is all about climate services, adapting, flexibility, keep on top, on tiptoes. My slides are also available on the folder in the Google Drive. So, if everything goes to, you can always go there. But anyway, so I now move into this idea of co-production, because this is also, it's one of the key buzzwords at the moment. So everywhere where you see climate services, co-production is there. So this has become the kind of the thing you need to do, or you need to pretend you do, because obviously there's different, it means different things to different people, and depending where you come from, it can also just be a ticking box exercise. So there's also a lot of discussion on that. Actually, one of my papers talks about that. So this one, Bruno Soares and Bontempo, talks a bit about, so, do we always need to co-produce? And if so, how do we think about it and all that? But anyway, stepping back. Co-production. Co-production actually is it's a theoretical concept that comes from, actually initially came from the medical sciences. So this idea of, developing products that fits the patients and things like that. And then it evolves into different disciplinary approaches. So for example, science and technology studies. So the work by Sheila Jesenov works a lot around this topic, but also political sciences, geography. Everyone is, kind of touches upon co-production at some point or another, because there's been this massive shift in terms of the science that is, just produced as basic research, blue sky thinking, and this movement towards developing science that is actually science addressing specific societal and wicked problems, such as, for example, climate change. So there has also been kind of this shift between how society, how the research community understands the development of science itself. So this fits within that, this need within climate services. The idea of co-production is basically, and again, there's different definitions. I just included there one of them, but there's that idea of bringing together the stakeholders, whoever they are. So anyone with a stake in what's being developed should be somehow included in the process. Obviously, these can mean different things. It can be done to different extents. There's no kind of one single recipe for how we do this, but it basically lies on this idea of bringing together people to develop something that that is of use to whoever that information is destined to. So it kind of fits very well with the idea of climate services, if you think about it. So co-production is a lot of the times understood as the kind of underlying processes that kind of allow climate services to be developed. But again, this can be, there's also a spectrum here. It can be, depending on the climate services, co-production can be done in a more, in a more kind of consultative way, as you see there in the image. So this was a diagram put together by Carter et al., which is the handbook on the co-production that I've shared with you. It's one of the materials we share with you. So this idea that it can go from being very static, just kind of consulting the users at very specific points, down to the very kind of really full-on immersive, iterative, flexible kind of consultation process, and where the users are very much very closely involved with the development of the service. So that's kind of a spectrum as well. It means different things to different people as well. And there's currently a lot of work being done in terms of understanding, unpacking what actually co-production mean on the ground when we're talking about climate services. So there'll be a lot of work being done at the moment in Africa, for example, because there's been a lot of recent efforts and initiatives and funding mechanisms being injected into developing climate services in Africa. And there's a lot of work being done on trying to understand and unpack a bit what that means exactly in terms of co-production. What it means when we say we're co-producing these kind of climate services. So watch this space. There'll be a lot of publications coming out soon. And I just included there another paper by Scott Bremer and Meish. And Scott is very good, actually. He's working with me in another project I'm working on at the moment. And he kind of he looked at the literature in terms of climate change initiatives and try and kind of untangle the different meanings of co-production in different contexts. And that's really interesting because it gives you a flavor as well of where we kind of see the co-production, the way co-production can be done, and the purposes for doing co-production within the context of climate change initiatives. So it's a really good paper. So I would suggest you read it if you're interested in it. Next slide. Next slide. It's me. Sorry. Okay, so this is a diagram that I've put together basically based on my experience, and this is something I've been kind of developing over the years, and this is very much just, again, a very succinct way of presenting a lot of ideas and things. So it kind of summarized a bit of what I've been saying over the last few slides. So why the need to co-produce climate services? There's a lot of different things there, obviously including their knowledge and their expertise. They're experts on their context and their decision making, and we need their understanding so we can actually develop effective climate services, understanding their needs, improve the use of the climate information, of course, because that's ultimately the aim we're all hoping for. But there are also some kind of other obviously test and co-evaluate. There's also a lot of co-evaluating the added value of those services as opposed to not using that information. So there's also another area of a lot of research being done at the moment. But there's also other aspects that are also relevant. So this ongoing idea of, developing collaborations, gaining trust between people. Co-production takes a long time. So the fact that a lot of these collaborations that you forge with organizations, and this means the teams internally, but also other organizations throughout the process of co-producing climate services, they tend to then lead to other types of work and other types of projects and things like that. So Antonio, for example, is a clear example of that. We worked with Antonio in the Oporius project, and we're now working with Antonio in this project, where we're developing a much more refined service for the organization is embedded on. So there's a lot of aspects that can also be gained. It's not just about obviously developing effective and usable climate services, but there are also other gains to be made in this context. So this is slightly different. So the previous slide is about why. This is how to co-produce. It sounds in paper it sounds pretty straightforward, right? And quite well, at least to I think at first appearances it might sound quite straightforward, but there's a few aspects that I think need to be ensured throughout. And obviously there needs to be, I'm just going to touch upon a few of these. We can discuss this later on if you want, but obviously there needs to be a shared goal. So obviously when we're bringing different people, being the producers, the in-betweeners, the users, and other people that might be involved in the development of climate services, there needs to be a shared goal. Otherwise, the tendency will be for different people working towards their own vested interests. So there needs to be a shared goal developed between everyone involved, and that needs to be kind of kept on the back of the work that is being done as a reference to be taken. The ongoing involvement, and obviously this depends as well the range of co-production level we want to achieve, but obviously it can vary a bit depending on the work and what are we aiming to achieve, their willingness to be involved, how they're being involved, and so on and so forth. So this idea also effective feedback loops as well. It needs to work very well. Obviously, people need to be in keeping ongoing communications. It's very easy to go in tangents. So obviously, ensuring that these feedback loops are active and ongoing is very important. And there's a lot of people that adopt agile approaches to how they manage the climate service development. So the agile approach is a project management approach where they kind of set short targets, and they kind of it's a way of them managing the fast pace at which these kind of things tend to be developed. Flexibility, adaptability, very, very important. Conditions change, organizations change, people change. The climate science evolves, all of this needs to be taken into consideration, keeping in mind that these processes normally takes years. So obviously a degree of flexibility and that adaptability is really important. And then obviously the time to co-produce takes a long time, and I'll give an example in a bit. And then resources and expertise. We need to obviously have the right conditions to be able to develop this effectively. This is the example I just wanted to show you. So this is one of the pre-operational climate services we developed within the Oporius project. It doesn't really matter what it is, I can quickly tell you, this was the service was with farmers in the southwest of the UK, and I was leading the engagement aspects of it, so the co-production. And this is just to give you an idea of the time that it took to develop, and the amount of kind of formal interactions, because we had other in-between interactions, but these were kind of the formal points at which we really kind of officially engage with them. Although we had also other feedback loops with the farmers, in the sense of they were able to provide feedback through the platform where the service was provided, and so on and so forth. But this was just, from the beginning of the project, from the beginning of the climate service in July, September 2014, down to the end of 2016, that's how long it took us to really understand what they needed, how they needed, develop the service. And the service was being provided through a mobile app and a website app, where they had access to seasonal forecasts and also 14-day forecasts. But this was the amount of time that took us to really pin down exactly what they needed and how they needed. It took us 2 years to then be able to officially test the tool, where they had access to the live update seasonal forecasts, and they were able to use it in real time in their, to inform their activities. But it took us 2 years to get there. Just to give you an idea of how technical and difficult, and it takes time and commitment. And obviously farmers and organizations in general are very busy, so you also need to work with that. Any questions on this? Okay, so what can go wrong? Pretty much everything. No, it's just these are just some of the common pitfalls that can happen. And I tend to group these in 4. There's more. These are just kind of the main common ones. The first one is language communication, and this means in the context of climate services and interdisciplinary teams, the potential to go wrong and for people to have different understandings of what different words mean, making assumptions of what's being said, it's huge. So it is important to really reflect on that and remind ourselves that we are collaborating with people that might not have our kind of experience, our types of background, and our kind of education. So it is important not to assume things, and this even means within the technical teams. This can happen within the technical teams, so people working together in themselves. So that is really important. The other one is the lack of it. It can happen as well. Kind of reaching a point where there's a lack of internal capacity, resources, and that might be within the project itself, the team, or within the organization that is working with us. The organization in terms of for example, the potential end user, right? People might change. Understanding what's really required. That's also a common pitfall, and assuming we know what they need, and then actually, things transpired, and towards the end we realized that was actually not the case, or things have changed. So there's a lot of translation work that needs to keep being done throughout the process. It's not at the first stage you understand their user needs, and then that's it. You need to constantly going back and really try to pin down if that's still the case, if things have changed or not, and so on and so forth. And then expectations, again, obviously people, partners, colleagues, organizations come into this effort of developing climate services with different expectations, with different requirements, different backgrounds, experiences. There is the possibility of disagreements, and then obviously it needs to be dealt diplomatically. So there's a lot of, potential pitfalls there as well. And then ultimately the ethics and values of the climate service itself. Obviously there are the straightforward ones, which is obviously we're all working towards a common goal. So obviously collaboration, integrity is critical, right? But also the transparency, the humility of working together. There's also more ethical aspects that are actually now being more on the focus of research, academic research, in terms of the ethical implications of developing climate service in general. So in terms of, for example, governance aspects, access to data, IPR issues, things like that. So this is just in a nutshell, but just some of the the common challenges and pitfalls that might happen when we're trying to co-develop, co-produce climate services. Any questions? Or the next few slides, you'll be happy to hear, is about just how we did it in MedGold, just to give you an idea of how we co-produce climate services. Questions? I can hear someone, so I'm wondering if someone wants to talk or...
Marta, I just have a quick question. Do you have an example of something that went wrong in your project with the farmers in Southwest England? One of those 4 things that maybe went wrong?
It was a while back. Let me see. I think it didn't went wrong. It was quite successful. I think a couple of things maybe I can reflect on. One was the project focused on seasonal, and mainly on seasonal actually. And we quickly realized that being farmers, their focus was more on the kind of immediate next few days. So we had to kind of compromise a bit. So we obviously, within the scope of the project, we wanted to explore the potential usability of seasonal forecasts to inform their specific decision-making processes. But at the same time, we had to compromise to give them something that they could really relate more easily with. So we kind of, the compromise was, which worked quite well, was to provide them the 14 days 14 days forecast that they wanted to kind of complement the seasonal. So rather than just providing them seasonal, we would give them the 2, and they were able to reflect a bit better on that. So, and this comes back to the flexibility and adaptability. There's always a bit of negotiation and compromise between, you know, what we want to achieve as researchers and a project and what actually they need and they want. So I think it is important to recognize that things need to be discussed and needs to be agreed. So there's always a bit of scope for that. And the other thing is when they then officially assessed the service, it was really interesting the findings that we got. Some of the farmers actually used the seasonal forecast to inform their decision making, which for us was fantastic because we weren't expecting. I don't know if you know, but the reliability of seasonal forecasts in Europe depends a bit on the regions and on the seasons and all that. And given that the reliability of the forecasts we were giving them weren't, 80% reliability, let's say, was more around 50%, 60%. The fact that they took that on board and made decisions on that was quite eye-opening, and they kind of anyway, I have a paper on that if you want to read about it. But then we also realized that in some cases they weren't able to use at all. So they weren't able to act upon the information, not because they didn't want it or because they didn't trust it, but because there were other conditions that had happened in between that didn't allow them to act upon it. So I remember in a specific case, it had rained so much that the farmer wasn't able to act upon the information because the fields were completely flooded. So this to say that you can have the perfect service with the right conditions. They might be willing and happy to act upon it, and then something else comes in and might also obviously influence the way and they can act upon it. So, but I think I don't have, I suppose in terms of terminology, there was also, sorry, now that I'm talking about it, I'm remembering the scientific, the technical team developing the service were very adamant of providing the seasonal forecast with the climatology line. And the farmers were very, very confused about what the climatology line meant and what it was showing them. And there was, I remember I was in between the two, and the farmers wanted to remove the line in the forecasts that were being developed for them, and the climate scientists were adamant that the climatology line needed to be presented. So there was, I think it was a 2 months discussion on should we include or not include the climatology line. The farmers won. They removed the climatology line, but it took, so, and this comes back to the idea of scientific rigor and standards, so managing expectations. So there was a lot of discussions with scientists saying, look, they don't need the climatology line. This is confusing them. So maybe you need to put aside your standards because this is not about you, it's about them. So that was also another example. But yeah, really interesting. It's a really awesome. Interesting and challenging. Yeah. Okay, so assessing user needs, and this is oh, actually this is not MedGold. This is still about assessing user needs. Sorry, I'm going to flick through a bit. I'm not going through this, but this is some of the questions you need to think about when you're kind of, when you're first engaging with with the users involved, whoever they are, and how you should approach this kind of, you basically have to have an open discussion of what they want, what they're using, what they need, what they think they need. Sometimes they don't know what they need. Sometimes we think we know and we don't know. So it needs to be an open and frank and transparent discussion there, and really try to break down those assumptions and making sure terminology is clear. That's really, really critical. There are different methods for engaging the users, and these are, I mean, being a social scientist, I tend to use more of the social sciences, so they tend to be more participatory methods of assessing user needs. Here, this table is just kind of the common, there's more, but these are some of the common methods you can use to engage with users, and this might be at the beginning when you're first assessing user needs, but also throughout the process of co-development, co-production. So, and I've just put it there. Again, this is based on experience and literature on research methods and things like that. But obviously there's advantages, disadvantages to each of the methods. There's different ways of delivering them. And obviously with the pandemic, we all reverted to online delivery of this, which also brings other challenges on how to do that, because creating a rapport with the organizations becomes a bit harder, but not impossible. So this all to say that for you to decide which method you want to apply, at what points, there's a number of aspects you need to consider. Obviously, the type of engagement, the type of, if you're developing a full-on co-production immersive approach to it, they need to be much more ongoing and much more participatory and so on and so forth. So in that end of the spectrum, the users are basically considered like, for example, in MedGold, they are partners in the project. So they are integral to the development of the climate service. They're not just someone that we go and talk occasionally. So they are officially, formally involved in the development of the climate service. But also the type of information it's required to develop the climate services, the resources, the budget, the time, the people you have to deploy the methods as well. The kind of contacts you have available as well. So all of these need to be considered when you're deciding which methods you want to deploy, why and when and how, and so on and so forth. These are just some photos, nice photos of us doing some kind of, well, actually we were mapping needs and understanding needs against timescales. And yeah, that's me in the background as well. I think I can't remember which project this was, to be fair, but I think this was a workshop in trying to assess some of the needs of people. I think actually these were two different projects, but anyway. So just some quick, and again, I can have a chat. Actually, I will be talking about methods next Monday. So I'll be going in more in depth in terms of how to approach the different methods and how to think about engaging with users a bit more. So, co-production means different things. It can have different levels of involvement. It can be an effective way of bringing the users and the range of stakeholders that need to be involved in the development of the climate services. It requires different resources, expertise, time, flexibility, and all of that. There are intermediary organizations that can help bridge those gaps, depending if it's an operational service or if it's being developed in a research context. So there's a lot of things that need to be considered when you're thinking about it. Again, attention to pitfalls, and this can happen in every single context, either be operational or in a more research-based context. And finally, users, if they are not an integral part of your project, like for example in MedGold, they tend to be very busy. So if they don't have their time accounted for to be involved in the development of the climate service, you need to be considered that they're not being paid to do that. So there will be difficulties and you need to adapt to engage with them when they are free, basically. So that's it. These are the references I was telling you about, so have a look at these. And just very quickly, because I am aware of time, this is how we kind of developed the MedGold pilot services, 3 different services across the 3 different crops. That's the 4 steps we kind of, the broad steps we used throughout. We started with assessing user needs and then developed testing of the service, had a lot of interactions as well with the users. And then we're now at the stage where we're assessing the value of the services actually. So we're in the final stage as well. And all of the steps have been underpinned by a very close, collaboration with the partners, with the user organizations. it sounds very linear, but it's more like this, as you see at the bottom. So it's kind of really cyclical. It's messy. It goes back and forwards. You keep adjusting things, and there's a lot of feedback loops and all of that. So it's not linear at all. That's just a very simple representation of how we've approached it. In terms of assessing user needs, we were aware that we had different crops, different services to be developed, different organizations, different interests. And obviously, we kind of had to account for that. But we also had common areas of inquiry. So we started by understanding, broadly their context, where they're operating, I can hear myself. The kind of the vulnerabilities, how they make up their decision making, the kind of operations they have, if they're already using weather and climate information, for example, like a SOGRA app, and how that information could be improved. So trying to understand where within their current modus operandus this new climate service could fit. Obviously, given that this was a climate service, this was being developed to fit their specific needs. So the first assessment of user needs was to try and understand that, where we could fit in. And this, in terms of methods, this meant going and engaging with them in different ways. Again, recognizing different resources, time available, the types of people within the organizations where we're engaging with, and so on and so forth. So in some cases, it meant workshops. In other cases, meant focus groups and closer discussions with people. But the kind of the areas of inquiry we were applying were fairly common, across the three crops, climate services. And this is just an idea of kind of the initial mapping we did in terms of where we saw the key operations and the key decisions and activities being pursued across the three user organizations against the kind of the time scale of the information that would be useful for them. And you could see that there's a bit of a difference between the three different crops of focus and the kind of from the weather down to the long-term climate change projections. We also have I didn't put it here, but we have a good paper from Medgold on this. So where we map the activities across this, based on the literature and also the work we've done in Medgold, of these three different crops against the timescales and the kind of information that could be useful for them. Again, we also did literature review, of course. It's not just about talking to them, understanding what knowledge is out there already, also understand where they fit within regulations, policy, and then there's also more technical work in terms of mapping or understanding the uncertainty and skill of existing science and information there, and then the development of this common ICT infrastructure that was also the basis for all the work we've done in terms of the climate services, the technical aspects of the climate services. And this is it. Sorry, I kind of skimmed through. I can talk a bit more about, actually, I'll go back and so that's it. Questions, answers? Well, I'll give you answers. You can ask it.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you very much for your presentation.
And sorry, I've kind of towards the end, but we'll have a bit more time next Monday. I'll talk a bit more about methods, and I can answer some of the questions you might have about this area of co-production and user needs, assessing user needs, and so on.
Yes, thank you very much. And let me remind to all the group that actually the parallel session that we are facing in the next event next Monday are thought to be technical, but also all the people coming from the groups, the different groups, could take part to each parallel session just to have a specific overview of a specific topic that could be also shared with the other colleagues in the teams. So it is something which is very practical and also very sectoral, but it could be for sure used as a knowledge source for all the groups, regardless the specific problem they have to face. So thank you very much again, Marta. Let me, since I do not see any questions, we can move on towards a very short recap for the next steps. Let me share my video and okay, and then I leave the floor to Alessandro for this recap slide. Please, Alessandro. You are muted.
Thank you, Massi. As Massi already mentioned here, and also Marta already mentioned, some information about our next hand-on session next Monday. In the next Monday, we'll have two parallel sessions, quite practical, as Massi said. One on the climate science in climate service, and we'll have two presentations in this path. One on the package Clisagri developed by JRC team in the framework of MedGold. And we'll have a live demonstration with the MedGold dashboard led by us. And this is in one specific room already reported over there. In the other part, we'll have some practical, as Marta said, something more practical about the socioeconomic aspect in climate service, and we'll have two presentations, one on the commercial viability of climate service, and this presentation will be made by the GMV team. GMV is another partner of MedGold, and then there is also other presentation, more practical, out of the theoretical framework presented today by University of Leeds by Marta on how to interact with users, so how we can prepare surveys, interview, and design a workshop, and so on. Will we send to you a Google Sheet where you can decide your path? Our strong suggestion is to split each team into more or less similar parts. So please split your team in two, and one part of the team could follow the first path, and one part of the team could follow the other path. However, the two path will be however recorded, and all the material will be however made available in the web repository. So you could have also some insight also on the path that you cannot follow. So this is just something for next Monday. However, you'll receive all the information by email and by the chat in Amazon Chime. I don't know if there are questions for this appointment. If it's not the case, okay, yeah. Thank you. If it's not the case, I think that we could have just 5 minutes, not more than 5 minutes of comfort break, and then we can reconvene in the 3 rooms for the 3 teams, just to meet our problem holders. So I have put over there in the chat the 3 different rooms where we have to meet. Is the green team will meet Horta in the Chime, in the meeting ID Chime reported here in the chat. The red team will meet the COP, and the blue team will meet Antonio from Sogrape in the final room. I'll report also all this information in the general chat of Chime. So you can have a break, 5 minutes, and we can reconvene before 12:30 in the 3 parallel session. And then we'll reconvene the general session next Monday afternoon at 2 p.m. Central Europe Summer Time in the general room before splitting into the 2 parts. I don't know if there are questions. Otherwise, we can go. Yeah,
I
please,
just want
Marta.
to clarify something. So the teams will meet after the break into their own rooms, and then we'll discuss between ourselves and ask questions to the problem holders, and then it's up to us to decide when we want to finish and close.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Exactly. Okay. If there are any other point, we will meet in our breakout rooms with the 3 teams. Have a good break.
Bye-bye.